giving me this opportunity to come and speak to you this morning. When I was asked to come and speak, we had a few email exchanges on what may be an interesting topic to speak about. And we decided that what we would do is to take a couple of steps back and talk about the conceptual framework on which our policy making, the reforms and governance and changes that are being done by the government today on the economic field are based. And this is important because we live in one of those turning points in Indian history when the underlying meta-narrative is being replaced. As many of you know, Prime Minister Modi very often refers to the new India. Now, what does this new India really mean? If I had to summarize it, what it really means, it's a switch, it's a transition from an old India which was based on patronage, hierarchy, and rent-seeking, to an India that is based on rule of law, based on entrepreneurship, and social mobility. In particular, it's about manthan. Now, the word manthan, as many of you know, means churn. It's a particular favorite word of mine, and I've named one of my books about it. And it's a very important concept, of course, in Indian mythology, the idea of Samudra Manthan, which is really from where Puranic history starts. But what does it mean when you apply it to the economic space? What it really means in this context is the churn of ideas, both new and old. It means social mobility, the idea that if you work hard and you have talent and you're willing to take risk, you can go anywhere, no matter where you started in the hierarchy. It means that you have an economy based on entrepreneurship, innovation, and most importantly, risk-taking. Now, what does this really mean when I translate this into actual economic policy making? And to understand this, let me show you how the conceptual framework, the meta-narrative, is fundamentally different, not just from the old Nehruvian socialist meta-narrative, but also very much from the conventional meta-narrative and framework of conventional, traditional economics. And this is important because, as you will see, when you have a much more fluid view of the world, then it leads to very, very different conclusions about how we need to go about changing India. Now, not just for socialist economists, but also for many traditional mainstream economists, the economy is essentially a gigantic machine. And this is very important to understand because, you see, this rather Newtonian view of economics pervades many of the things we think about when we are thinking about economic policy. This is why many of the terms used in economics derived ultimately from Newtonian physics. Terms like liquidity, which is essentially a hydraulics term, or equilibrium, or the idea that you use levers of monetary and fiscal policy. As you can see, the underlying idea is that the economy is some sort of a Victorian steam engine running along a fixed line, which we use the term trend line, and that economic policy making essentially is to do the following: that if the economy is speeding up too much, you apply the brakes, and if it is slowing down, you shovel in more coal into the economy and speed it up. That is essentially the sum total of much of macroeconomics as conventionally practiced. But what if the economy is not a machine, but an evolving organic ecosystem? A chaotic being that is buffeted by all kinds of shocks, black swans of all kinds, technological shocks, geopolitical shocks, domestic political shocks. What if it is continuously mutating? This is basically a worldview of unintended consequences, of butterfly effects. And when you think of an economy in this particular way, it leads you to very, very different conclusions. So in order to explain this, let me tell you a small story that will allow an analogy that will allow you to understand where we are coming from. Now, many of you have dogs, and I'm sure you take them to the park in order to throw a frisbee and get them to catch the frisbee. Now, most of you will throw the frisbee and the dog will catch the frisbee. But if you happen to be a mainstream economist, that is not what you will do. If you're a conscientious mainstream economist, you will go to the park first. You will measure the speed of the wind. You will then research the design of the frisbee. Then you will research the breed of the dog. Then you will research your own body type and your muscle strength. And you will feed them all into a general equilibrium model. And after several iterations, this general equilibrium model will give you a forecast. So you will take this forecast and you will hand it over to the Frisbee Policy Committee. And after many iterations, the Frisbee Policy Committee, which meets, of course, once every 2 months, will give you a forward guidance. So you'll take the forward guidance and you'll take your dog to the park, and then you will put a stake in the ground where the forward guidance is pointing, and you will tie your dog to the stake. Then you will walk back and throw the frisbee. Now, of course, even something as everyday as a park is actually a complex, chaotic place. There can be a gust of wind. There can be a slight change in the way you threw the frisbee. There can be a small scratch in the frisbee, all of which could cause the frisbee to land quite different from where the dog has been staked out. And guess what will happen? The dog will fail to catch the frisbee. And the economist will be entirely surprised by this. Meanwhile, most normal people are throwing the frisbee and the dog is catching the frisbee. Why is the dog able to catch the frisbee? The reason is that the dog is not even attempting to forecast where the frisbee will go. What the dog is doing is the following. Most normal dogs will basically look at the owner, get a general feel of where he's likely to throw the frisbee, and then once the owner has thrown the frisbee, they will look at the frisbee and adjust. They will run along, look at the frisbee and adjust. And as the frisbee comes down towards the ground, it will look very closely, keep its eye on the frisbee, jump and catch the frisbee. Now this is how you can navigate a chaotic, uncertain world. Essentially, feedback and adjust. Now this may seem obvious, but unfortunately, as I pointed out to you, most economists do not use this approach to make policy making. But when you use this framework, this conceptual framework, to begin making policy making, you lead to very, very different approach and very, very different priorities. Now you can tell that the economic framework that I have described for you, is essentially an organic, changing system in which we are adapting all the time, where essentially long-term forecasting and planning is not what matters. What matters is having a broad framework and being able to deal with changing situation flexibly. That is what really matters in this environment. Now, let me show you how this feeds into the priorities and sequencing of what this government is doing, and also how it is going about doing it. Now that you have understood what I am talking about, you will see that it is absolutely no surprise that one of the most important and first policy initiatives of this government was to put in place a bankruptcy code. Because you see, in an organic, evolving world, if you want an entrepreneurial economy, then you cannot have a warehouse like the BIFR. What you need is the ability to continuously deal with exit and failure. If you want a risk-taking economy, you want to be able to allow continuous ability to fail, and this has to be dealt with on an ongoing basis. Let me clarify right up front, this is not because somehow we policymakers have something against entrepreneurs and failure. Far from it. All we are saying is that there shouldn't be any social stigma to failure. Now, this is quite different from, I'm not talking about fraud here. Fraud should be, of course, investigated whether or not it is a failure or the business is a success. Even if it is a success, it should still be investigated. So this is not about fraud. This is about genuine risk-taking and failure. And there should be no social stigma attached to it. Because this is the only way in which we can move forward with this new worldview we have. But it also means that we have to have a system by which we carry out continuously cleaning the system. Which feeds into the second very major initiative that we have that we are currently going through, which is the cleanup of the banks. Again, remember what I talked about. Talking about a patronage-based, static, rent-seeking economy is being transformed into an entrepreneurial, churning, risk-taking economy. Which is why we need to clean up our financial system, specifically the banking system. Now, many people, till the beginning of this year, had argued that we need to create a bad bank. Now, why did we not go through and create a bad bank? And why did we opt for doing what we are doing, is using the bankruptcy codes and the NCLT to actually force through resolution, liquidation, whatever it may be. This is the intellectual framework from which it derives. The idea that if we had put it in a bad bank, yes, it would have been much faster in terms of the fact that you would have probably recapitalized the banks much more quickly, but it wouldn't have resolved the central problem, which is that you would have had a bad bank, which would have basically become another BIFR, a warehouse for dying enterprises that for a variety of reasons, good or bad, may have essentially failed. What we would much rather do is to clean up the banks, to change the way allocation of capital is done, so that we can, in fact, begin to expand this economic system and the banking system yet again. Now note that what I'm saying is not entirely a unique way of thinking about the world. Ironically, many other countries do this. Many of you are familiar with China, but in your back of your mind, somehow there is this idea that China is really about this grand, centrally planned economy. That has not been the case for a very, very long time. If you, in fact, ask the Chinese to describe how they make policy, they will use something Deng Xiaoping used to say, which is to cross the stream by feeling the stones, which is essentially the same point I'm making, which is feedback loops and flexibility. And since we have come to the East Asian model, let me now show you how this meta-narrative, this conceptual framework, feeds through to the economic model that we are constructing piece by piece. Now, since this whole this conceptual framework is all about evidence-based adjustment and not ideology or model-based or theory-based policymaking, obviously, the best evidence of sustained economic growth comes from East Asia. And although there are some differences in what they have done, there is a broad model that we have used, which, by the way, as I will show you, is not so different from what the West did in the 19th and early 20th century. And the model goes, at the risk of course, oversimplifying, the model goes roughly like this. Essentially, the country goes through a demographic shift. The demographic shift means that the proportion of population of working age suddenly sharply goes up. This, of course, creates a larger workforce, but it also creates an upward bias in the savings rate. Now, when you begin to deploy this workforce into working, this workforce begins to generate an income and begins to save part of it. This savings then finds its way into the financial system. The financial system then expands rapidly and deploys this into investment. This act of deployment then creates investments and, of course, creates more jobs, which creates more savings, which feeds back into the financial system, which creates more investment. Now, note that this is not an act of moving from one equilibrium to another equilibrium. This is about creating virtuous cycle. Totally different idea. Now, we in India are just about entering this phase of demographic transition, as many of you know from ad nauseum consultants and economists telling you on PowerPoint presentations that we are about to enter this great phase of demographic transition, or have just entered it, and are likely to be in the sweet spot for something like 25, 30 years. We have also gone through a period recently of reasonably high growth. So why is it that we do not get into this virtuous cycle? The reason is that this virtuous cycle requires you to have savings being sucked into the financial system and then having efficient deployment at the other end. Now, this doesn't unfortunately happen in India. Why? Because when you suddenly create a series, an expansion in the system, the savings that are generated by this are not sucked up by the banking system because of a number of reasons. One is, of course, cultural, perhaps, preference for gold and other valuables. Some part of this leaks into the black economy. Some part of that black economy then flows outward. A large part of it gets stuck in cash. And therefore, you can create one round of growth, but you don't get this sustained feedback loop. The same problem exists, by the way, on the investment side. The banking sector takes in these resources, and then it deploys it. Unfortunately, it deploys it badly, as we can clearly see from our current NPA problem. Now, you may argue that so what? There are many countries in East Asia which had a bad loan problem. Look at China. It has sustained it for 30 years. Yes, there are a few economies like China which have indeed sustained this process despite having bad loan deployment. But they have a very different political economy. There are actually many more examples of where this process got going and blew up. There is no particular reason why India would be a China and not a Philippines or Indonesia or Thailand or Malaysia, all of which did in the 90s begin to create this virtuous cycle and then had the Asian crisis and blew up and never quite got back into the cycle again. So what we are attempting to do is ex ante attempting to clean up the banking system. This is not because we do not want this banking system to expand. Quite to the contrary, we want a much larger banking system by an order of magnitude than we have now. But we recognize that we need to clean it up now. Now that you have understood what the broad model is, now I hope you can clearly see what the logic of many of the steps taken by this government are. The Jan Dhan Yojana. What is this about? This is about creating accounts for a large part of this country which does not have these accounts. Because once you give them accounts, the idea is, when you give them jobs and they get savings, much of the savings will come back in. This is the logic by which you need to see demonetization. This is the basis on which you need to see this huge crackdown that is being done on the black economy. Because without doing that, this virtuous cycle cannot be started. Now, the same logic, by the way, applies on the other side, as I said. This is the reason we are carrying out this huge effort to clean up the banking system. As I pointed out to you, this is absolutely critical if we want to expand the system and keep it going for 2-3 decades of high growth. Now that I've given you a broad framework of how we are going about it, I think you will begin to ask me, okay, what next? How do we think about what are the things we will go into the future? Now, when you have a churning, complex approach to making policy, you will see that it is also means that it changes the way we implement many of these policies. The old way of making policies would have been, we debated it for 5 years, 10 years, created the very perfect system of and then implemented it over 5 years. And like the economist in my story, been entirely surprised when it didn't work. And then we'll say, हाँ, plan ठीक नहीं था, or otherwise we will say, depending on who is who in government, we'll say, implementation ठीक नहीं था. But the point is, it's not either about the planning or the implementation. The problem is, this whole approach itself is flawed. Now let me show you how we are going about it. Now, when GST was implemented in July, this has been debated now for 20-odd years. And everybody said, oh my God, we are still not ready for it. Let's do it next year when we have got all the pieces in place. Instead, what the government did is to take the view that no matter when it was implemented, it's such a complex thing in such a complex country that it would be full of unintended consequences. It would be full of butterfly effects. And no matter how well we planned it, it was still going to be quite unknown what would actually happen when we implemented it. So, what we have done is to have a broad framework and actually begin doing it and finding out what happens when you do it and fixing it along the way. Now, this looks like a much more messy way of doing it, but frankly, at the end of 6 months, it will be done. After 20 years of thinking about it, it'll take us 6 months to get something done. And yes, we are aware that it is not a perfect system, but huge amount of feedback is coming to us. We are fixing it. And of course, right now we are overwhelmed with some of this feedback, but don't worry. One piece at a time, it will be fixed. And yes, it's more complicated than we would have liked it to be, but there were certain compromises that had to be made. But once both the central government and the state governments are more or less comfortable with the system, it will be simplified. But yes, it will happen through a process of iteration, not through having this grand 5-year plan right in the beginning. Same approach, again, is being taken with the cleaning up of the banks. It would have been wonderful to have this great plan, this great bad bank. Yes, it would be wonderful if we had this everything set in stone with our bankruptcy process. Instead, we have taken 50 of the most difficult cases and put it into a completely new system. It is not because we are unaware that the NCLT system is untested. Of course we are aware. But our view is, how else will you find out whether it works? And the best way, in fact, to create the case laws, create precedences, is in fact to take these through the process. Yes, we will find out the lacuna, as we have in fact done very recently with the real estate case, where clearly this is not in fact a failure, this is actually finding out that there was a stakeholder, which was the owners in real estate, or the people who had bought flats and apartments in real estate projects. They are also stakeholders in this process, and they are inadequately brought into the current legislation, and that there are some problems between the bankruptcy legislation and other rules and regulations like RERA, the consumer protection rules and so on. This will again be fixed. But the only way you're going to actually find out this is by wading in, not by ex-ante trying to work out every possible outcome that could possibly have ever been. If we had gone through that thing, we would still be debating this. Instead, we have waded in, found out what the problems are, and they will be fixed. And in this process of feedback loops, and adjustment, we are managing to do a lot more reforms than has ever been imagined. And let me warn you, some more are in the pipeline. I know many of you will say, oh my God, not more. But as you get used to this process, you will see that we are beginning to do things very quickly after dreaming and planning and cajoling for years and years and years. Take Air India, for example. We thought about it forever. Now, is it the case that we have a perfect, clear plan for how exactly Air India will be privatized? No. We have a rough idea, and we have one of our some of our best minds working on how it will be done. And given the options at the time, it will get privatized. It will get done within less than 12 months, perhaps a lot less than 12 months. Same thing will happen with labor laws. Is it the case that we will have the perfect labor law at the end of the process? No. But what we have already initiated, as you may have read in the newspapers, taken 40-odd central laws, turned them into 4. Now they again, at the very least, it will simplify it. Now you have 4 laws. Many of the internal contradictions of those 40 laws have been worked out. Now, is it the case that it is perfect? No, it is not. But now we have 4 laws. We know what the lacuna is, and we will fix them along the way. It's a radical improvement on what it was. Let not perfect be the enemy of the good. And let not this be the last iteration of fixing the problem. This is a thinking process that I want you to imbibe. And I'll use another analogy so that you understand where I'm coming from. Since I've spent a lot of my life in Singapore, I'm going to use Singapore as an analogy. You see, when you come to India, everybody complains about the state of the cities and how it's run. So when you ask people, okay, so what do you think is the best run city and best planned city in India? They will inevitably tell you, it is Chandigarh. And then you ask them, okay, what is the best run city in the world? They'll think for a while, and almost all of you will say, Singapore. So the impression you have given is basically that, Chandigarh is the national champion, Singapore is the global champion, and if Chandigarh works a little harder, he will become Singapore. In fact, they are completely opposite approaches to city building. And no matter how hard Chandigarh tries, it'll never be Singapore, and let me explain why. You see, Chandigarh is a hardwired city. When Le Corbusier was asked to design cities, he basically made this point that cities and buildings were machines for living. Remember the analogy I used right in the beginning about machines? He used those words, very words, machines for living. And how do you build a machine? You basically build a machine by meticulously working out a plan, a design, and meticulously implementing it. Now look at what Singapore did instead. If you went back to the 1960s, that's when Singapore became free. That was roughly the time that Chandigarh was also being built. Now Singapore became free in about 1965. When it became free, it was one of the poorest countries in the world. It had no economic prospect at all. It was so bad that Malaysia actually threw it out of the federation. That's why the S in Malaysia actually comes from Singapore. It was thrown out of the federation. It was a crowded, slum-ridden city with communal riots run by gangster triads. Now, Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew saw this city with absolutely no prospects, and he essentially had only one asset, which was that there had been a British naval base there for a long time, and since the naval ships were leaving, this naval base was going to be empty. So basically converted this naval base into a container shipment port. And very quickly, Singapore became the world's largest container shipment hub. He also invested in very low-end manufacturing. Many of you do not know that Singapore started out as a place to make cheap ready-made garments. And many of them were rip-off garments. There were brands from there like Crocodile, which were Lacoste rip-offs. And then, by the 70s, this model was already so successful that Singapore was no longer a low-end manufacturer. So they moved up by the 80s into electronics. And those of you who remember the 80s and 90s will remember that Indians used to go to Singapore to buy cheap electronics. They would go to Mustafa and just load up. But by the 90s, it was already obvious that Singapore was already too expensive for making electronics. So it moved up to becoming a financial hub. And more recently, it has turned itself into an entertainment and education hub. Now, nobody in this room would have thought about sending their kids to study in Singapore in the 1970s and 80s, but I know many of you may already have sent your kids to Singapore today to study. Now what, as I can show you, as you can see, that this was not about having this great vision of Lee Kuan Yew right in 1965 about where Singapore was going. It is about feedback loops, risk-taking, and flexible adjustment. Meanwhile, back here in India, in Chandigarh, the city authorities are very, very proud that they have stuck to Le Corbusier's original plan. And as a result of which, Chandigarh is essentially a subsidy scheme for civil servants. It is not a city at all. And the reason I'm telling you this story is this. We need to change out of this mindset that we need to have this grand plan in the beginning and get into the mindset that we live in an organic, chaotic world. And just like entrepreneurs need to adjust, policymakers also need to adjust in this world. Now, this does not mean that there are no anchors in this framework. There are anchors. But those anchors are somewhat second-order anchors, but are very, very important to understand. And a lot of it relates to rule of law. So it's ultimately about enforcement of contracts. So if you want a genuine debate in this country, please start a debate on the legal system, not just the judicial system, but the broader legal system and reforming it. Start a debate on reforming and simplifying laws, which is happening, by the way, as 1,000-odd old laws have in fact been removed from the statute books, as you may be aware. And I'm going to end with a major reform that we want a public debate on, which is there included, by the way, in the latest economic survey that some of you may have read, which is called the Transparency of Rules Act. The Transparency of Rules Act basically tries to look at a fundamental problem in India, which is that, yes, the state expects the citizens and businesses to follow the rules of the land, but in India it's extremely difficult to find out what those rules actually are. I'm not just talking about the grand rules and laws that are debated in Parliament, but about the everyday rules, regulations, forms, procedures that you as citizens have to deal with. It is very difficult to know, not just citizens, very often the civil servants who are applying these rules are also not very clear what those rules are. So what this does is that it leads to a lot of inefficiency, delays, litigation, not to mention corruption. So the transparency of rules will have the following three elements, and you will see together how they try to solve this problem. The first element of the Transparency of Rules Act of TORA is that all citizen and business facing rules and regulations of every department will have to be placed on the website and notice board of the relevant department in English and Hindi and regional language as may the case be. This in itself is not a great revolution, but listen to the next bit. Those rules and regulations which are not explicitly stated on the website after this department is declared TORA compliant, those rules will be deemed not to exist. I.e., if the website does not explicitly state that ABC rule exists, if that rule is not there, no official can ask you to comply with it. So no more being told that I'm sorry, there is this 43 section A, subsection B that you have not complied with, or this form 99C which you have not filled out. If that form or rule has not been explicitly pasted on that department's website, it will be deemed not to exist. This is a major change in the relationship between the state and the citizen. Essentially what we are saying is, yes, the state has a right to ask the citizen to comply with the rules, but only if the citizen has a fighting chance of finding out what those rules are. This is a major change in the relationship between citizen and state. Second, not only will all the rules be there, they will now be presented as a whole, not as a series of circulars. This is not, again, something that's difficult technologically. All of you visit Wikipedia. What does Wikipedia do? Does Wikipedia ask you to go through the whole history and geography of how that particular post has evolved? No. It gives you the latest version. And so it will be with all the rules, regulations, and forms. The latest version is what the citizen will see. There will be a button on the side which will talk about the history. You can press on it and look on it and look at how it has evolved over time for those of you who are interested. But at this point in time, this is how the whole rules exist in its entirety today, after you have adjusted for all the changes. And the third element, which is that whenever a change is made, the date and time of that change is clearly stated. Essentially, therefore, you can go back and look that on the 20th of August, 2017, at 3 p.m., this is the rule that applied to me as a citizen. And therefore, this is the basis on which any discussion, litigation, etc. is to be carried out. Now, this is a very, very fundamental change. It will not just change, of course, the people of this room, but every citizen of India. Because even if you have a traffic problem with a traffic violation, you know, how much is the police constable allowed to fine you? Is he allowed to take your license, or isn't he allowed to take your license? What exactly is the fine? Is it 500 rupees or is it 1,000 rupees? To what extent is the constable given a discretion? All of these things will be explicitly obvious to you. Now, I've given you some flavor of the line of thinking. I'm now going to stop, and perhaps some of you have some questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sanyal. Well, ladies and gentlemen, after those rich insights there, we'll open the floor now for questions. So please do raise your hands. We'll have the mics passed on to all of you.
Yeah, so the government has done a good job of really not interfering in the banking system and giving constructive support till now. But, you know, in this insolvency proceedings, I mean, one of the legal aspects is that the current promoter can also bid. Now, there is a clear moral hazard there. So how do we, I mean, what's the government's view on this, that the same guy who is borrowed and defaulted is allowed to bid in that? And there's a clear issue there. So how do government look into this issue, please?
We have an NCLT. We do have a regulator for the bankruptcy process. As these issues turn up, they will be fixed along the view. We do not have an ex-ante view how we will fix such problems. There is a regulator and there is a tribunal, an NCLT. They will fix it as it comes along. This is a feedback and adjustment process. This is not a, we have a original plan standing up approach. This will be dealt with as we come up to it.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Could we please have a mic passed right ahead?
We really do appreciate the efforts that the government is doing to do all that you described to do, and it's clearly visible for all of us to see. In the spirit of feedback that you talked about, given that one of the important objectives is the cleaning of the banking system, I just want to reinforce the feedback from us in terms of the autonomy that you're giving to PSPs, specifically in areas like compensation, both to the person who leads the PSP and to the senior team, the various procedures that still handicap them from taking decisions as compared to private sector banks. We had a presentation by a PSC bank chief yesterday, and he alluded to some of these. It's a bit surprising that these constraints are still hampering the decision-making capacity of the PSP. So just a feedback loop back to you to fix that as quickly as possible.
Thank you. It is an issue, by the way, incidentally, much debated about in the government. Given the current systems that are there, it is very difficult to fix because of a number of issues. But we are aware of this, and some measures are being discussed. I'm not in a position to openly discuss them, but it is not something that people are not unaware of. But given the current sort of framework, it will require very, very dramatic changes in how PSBs are managed today in order to fix those problems. So it's not an issue that has not been discussed or unaware of, but this is, you'll be surprised how complicated it is, because once you begin to change that, many other things in the system begin to change as well. So it is an issue that is being discussed and will be carefully done. Thank you for the feedback nonetheless.
Sanjeev, I had a question here. So
yes.
basically, you alluded to, the fact that you have a population which gets into, the working age, and then that sets off a whole virtuous cycle of earning, saving, investment, etc. Now, I just wanted to get your thoughts on where we are, in that process, because while people talk about a demographic dividend, I think we're at a borderline where it could well turn into a demographic disaster if you don't have the right quantum of job creation being done. So there is a lot of talk about skill development, job creation, but when you talk to companies, most of them are talking of going the automation way, and they actually want to cut down on the workforce. If you look at the state of our institutions, right from primary education right up to professional education, a lot needs to be done there. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on how the government is looking at this, because this is an integral part of how the economy will grow going forward.
Absolutely. You have touched upon a very, very important issue. Hence, the emphasis on skill development. You may have also seen that we now have a new minister in this space, and there's a lot of effort being done in the education space as well. We are very aware that this cycle requires dramatic expansion in labor deployment. Now, we need to put this in the context of the fact that we have actually had very decent growth for now 15, 20 years, and not had this job creation expansion. The reason for that is partly that for a variety of reasons, the services industry did not generate the kinds of jobs we had anticipated. So less than 25% of the employment in this country is generated by the services sector, but it dominates our economy, something like 2/3 of the economy, the services sector, whereas it only generates a quarter of the jobs. And whereas agriculture is some 12, 13% of the economy and generates some 45% of the jobs. So there was clearly one of the problems was that the services sector was not, if it was the only source of growth, was not generating that virtuous cycle. Hence, this big shift to thinking about Make in India, getting the manufacturing sector going, and the construction sector going as well. But again, in that, we found that this could not be sustained for a number of reasons, which is that our banking system was not capable of supporting a large long-term expansion. As you saw, we did one round of expansion and we got stuck. So hence the business of cleaning up the banking system, because ultimately construction and manufacturing have to be a part of this. Now we understand that we, unlike the others, will be entering into this phase of industrialization, so to speak, at a time when automation will be a major issue. Therefore, there will be this issue of whether or not we will be able to generate the kinds of jobs. And it is again we need to adjust and adapt to this new environment. By the way, it may not necessarily be entirely a bad thing, by the way, because remember, for many countries, they already have established workforces in those sectors that are now going to be automated. We do not have an established workforce in many of those sectors. So yes, the established guys will hurt, but when we do carry out our expansion, hopefully we will be doing it with the new technologies, being fully aware of the fact that these things get automated. So in some ways, it is a benefit. We will leapfrog some of the sort of the ladder, so to speak, and hopefully enter into a more automated form, post-automation form of industrialization. This does not mean that we will necessarily create lesser jobs. One of the major things that we can take advantage of is our own internal market. Unfortunately, we didn't have an internal market till very, very recently. It was actually easier for Mumbai to trade with London than it was to trade with Delhi or Kolkata. And hence, one of the big things that we did put an effort into was to carry out this GST, which is hopefully an attempt to create an internal market. One of the reasons we do not have manufacturing despite, internal market, cheap labor and all the other stuff is because we have never leveraged the sheer scale of our market because we don't have an internal market, particularly for manufacturing. For services, it existed, but for manufacturing, it didn't exist. But this is why this was such a priority for this government to get this through. Even though, as I pointed out earlier, we knew that we hadn't got all the bells and whistles worked out. We did it because this has to be done. If we do not have an internal market, we cannot create the skills that are needed for competing in the rest of the world. And so this is one of the reasons we have gone about it this way, cleaning up banks, GST, and yes, there is still a lot to be done in education and skill development. We are aware on it, we are working on it. Whether we succeed or not, we'll let you decide in a year's time, but it's certainly a focus area.
Hi, thank you very much for your thoughts. I'm happy you talked about Transparency of Rules Act. Similarly, I wanted to ask you on the transparency of the policy making by the central government with a few particular examples. For example, when the government says that agricultural income needs to be doubled by 2022, I in particular struggle a lot to understand what do you mean by agriculture in particular. We were reminded yesterday agriculture is not only traditional food grains, but it's horticulture, it's farming, it's dairy, poultry. So do you mean doubling income of all these sectors which are a part of the agriculture sector or something else? When you say again doubling income, do you talk in nominal terms or in real terms? Because I'm sure the government must have done a lot of homework when they make some targets or they come in public with such thoughts. So why don't we see those papers or those homeworks in the public domain so that we can also get better understanding of what the government is doing?
I don't want to tread into the Niti Aayog space. But basically, there is a lot of thought being given to that particular issue. We have had a very cereals-oriented agriculture policy for a long time. That may have its historical reasons for it, because calorie value was the key thing that we thought about at a certain point in our history. Now we have gone past that cereal stage, and we are now beginning to think much more widely about agriculture. And so consequently in that context, for example, pulses are now being brought into the MSBs, but there, of course, vegetables and other things also need to be thought about. Dairy has to be thought about. There are a number of things. One is, of course, again, internal markets do matter. And here again, it is not still yet a completely open internal market, as you may know. So there are things, but ultimately 2-3 things will matter a lot for agriculture. And I would rather widen this out to rural incomes, because rural incomes don't only mean agriculture. One is simply creating a transportation backbone to this country. That was absolutely necessary. You can talk all about doubling incomes, tripling income. At the end of the day, you need a transportation backbone. And thanks to the efforts of successive governments, so not just this government, but this has happened now We now actually have a reasonably good highway system in this country. I think in some ways, while inside the city the roads may be terrible or whatever, you'll be surprised you can drive across large parts of India on actually world-class highways. So you can leave Delhi and drive through most of the country to, say, Kolkata, and you're driving on very, very good roads. In fact, when you hit the cities is when you hit bad potholes and so on. So this is one thing that is already done and exists. Large part of the country actually have good, decent backbone highways. One. Two, there is a major move that is being done to create an air network to the second tier. Right now we have very much a hub and spoke to Delhi, Bombay and a Bangalore type of. And this is again part of the Udan effort, which 33 new small airports are being built. Again, this is a business about creating a transport backbone. A huge amount of investment has gone into switching systems in the railways, which may not sound very cool, but in fact are absolutely critical to allowing the railway system to be optimized. And perhaps for the first time since independence, we are investing in these kinds of scales in the railways. So the transport backbone is getting done. The other part of it is, of course, the telecommunications backbone, which we are relying at least mostly on the private sector to do. Hopefully Jio and others will be able to provide that. So once we have this transportation and communications backbone, this will be able, hopefully, to transform radically the rural section of the country and essentially do what has, undo or at least slow down what has happened so far, which is growth based essentially on 3.5 large cities. So this is basically what has been driving much of India's growth. And 3.5 is obvious. I mean, Delhi, Mumbai, Bangalore, and 0.5 is Hyderabad. These are the 3.5 cities that have just grown at exponential rate, maybe Chennai as well to some extent. So the very largest cities in India have been the drivers of growth. We now need to spread that out a little bit. And as that spreads out, obviously, the supply networks into these cities will also change. You know, if we have an Allahabad growing or a Varanasi growing, that entire rural network around it begins to grow with it, supplying new kinds of food, dairy, you know, jobs of all kinds, non-agricultural jobs of all kinds, tourism, and so on. So this is part of that thing, but this can only be done once you have the basic framework. And of course, yes, supply of electricity, which is another major area of concern. You know, finally, I think we are getting to a stage where, you know, the vast majority of the villages in this country will have electricity. There's no point in talking about, you know, cold storage chains unless you have basic thing like electricity. So some of these framework backbone things are getting done.
Hi. Two questions from my side, both related to PSU banks. First is regarding the consolidation, the idea which is rooted by Government of India. Why now? Why it was not aggressively followed 2 years back, specifically now, because as the real economy per se is struggling, and when this consolidation theme will pick up, there would be a period wherein some of these PSU banks would be in a consolidation phase even after the merger. So, and who would support this real economy, especially investments and capex? That's the first question. I'll follow up with the second one.
I think don't confuse the consolidation with the bank expansion issue and the cleaning up of the banks. Let me absolutely be clear. The NPA cleanup is the top priority. Consolidation will also happen, but it is a second order thing. NPA cleanup is the first order thing that is being done already well and under place. Number one. Number two, yes, there's a lot of talk about consolidation, and yes, it is getting discussed. But let me be also very clear, we are not taking the 22 odd banks that are there and taking them down to 4 banks or 5 banks, as some journalists tend to speculate. This will be reduced somewhere in the 10 to 15 range, because we recognize that there is a too big to fail problem. Right now we have only one bank of that scale, State Bank of India. If we end up with 4 or 5 very large banks, then we will have a real problem and any one of them goes under for whatever reason in some future date, then the whole system will get. So we appreciate the too big to fail problem. We are not attempting to consolidate all these banks down to a very small number and create global champions or whatever it is. This consolidation will happen. It will be done gradually on commercial grounds. We fully appreciate that taking two not very successful banks does not in any way reduce the NPA problem. You know, you take, if you have two banks have got 100 rupees worth of NPAs, you add them up, they have 200 rupees worth of NPAs. So that does not in any way resolve it. We are also not attempting to do capital shopping, because after all, we the regulators have introduced those capital norms for good reason. There's no point in trying to circumvent our own capital requirements that we have put there for very good reason, as I pointed out. So this is not that. These are efficiency gains that can be got from branch consolidation, management concentration, and other things, or specialization in a particular sector. This will be done in a thoughtful way and done slowly and steadily. This is not a rush, and it's certainly not going to interfere with the cleanup of the banking system or the subsequent expansion.
We had two good...
I think you'll have to give some others a chance to ask questions. Thanks. I think, why don't we take it to the back, because there are a whole bunch of people at the back who are asking questions. There's a gentleman right at the end.
This was a follow-up question on job creation, and we have about 15 to 18 million youth coming into the job market. You spoke about employment generating sector. Agriculture is already there. But the three largest sectors which are growing are the construction, which we spoke about, tourism, and retail and textile. I wanted to know your views on what the government and we can do on increasing job creation and helping these sectors. Secondly, as far as the construction sector, we've done a lot of effort, but in ease of business, we've gone from 183 to 185 in the last 2 years, out of 190 countries. So what can we do to improve this sector going?
The government is entirely conscious of these issues, and the particular case of construction is important. Unfortunately, there were many, many serious problems with this sector. I don't need to tell you about the problem of robber barons and inefficient investments and so on that had plagued this sector for a long, long time. So this one big effort is being done, as you know, with RERA and others, in order to clean up this sector and remove this blatant rent-seeking behavior of certain developers. So some sort of a regulation is being imposed. Yes, during the transition period there will be some pain, but hopefully it will create a transparent system that is even-handed and provides protection to consumers. A similar thing is again being done with the infrastructure sector. Again, the whole approach was rapid expansion using public sector bank resources, and if it succeeded, great. If it doesn't, then you just socialize the failure. This whole cycle has got to change, and again, that's why a big focus of this bank cleanup has been on this specific sector. It is not that the government has always been right in many things. The government too has contributed on times to this problem. So these are things are being fixed, but they are being fixed, as I mentioned. As we are fixing them, we are discovering new issues, and we are fixing them along the way. But in the end, let me emphasize, we recognize that by introducing a large numbers of changes very, very quickly, whether it is now Air India privatization, GST, cleaning up of banks, demonetization, and a few other things that we may have on the pipeline, we are causing uncertainty to the system. We are very conscious of this. But bear with us. By the end of this year or early next year, we will have actually more or less completed this cycle, and you will have a much clearer view of what this new system is like. And then we will be in a position to again begin to expand this economy and go back to growth rates that we had before the slowdown. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, sir. I'm going to request you to please remain on the stage. And may I please invite Mr. Motilal Oswal and Mr. Nikhil Gupta, lead economist at Motilal Oswal Financial Services, to please come on stage to present a memento to Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal.